Toledo, Ohio, June 1995. The paramedics arrived too late. Francis Dalton, 75 years old, lay beside the Ford pickup he had been repairing when his heart simply stopped. The garage smelled of motor oil and old metal, the familiar scent of a life spent with his hands in engines. No warning, no goodbyes. Just a Thursday afternoon that ended with a body cooling on concrete, stained by 50 years of transmission fluid. His son Michael found him there. 48 years old, an accountant who had never understood why his father chose grease over spreadsheets. He stood in that garage surrounded by tools whose names he did not know and felt the weight of everything left unsaid. The funeral came 3 days later. Small, quiet, the way Frank would have wanted it. Family occupied the front pews. Neighbors filled a few rows behind. Sarah Dalton, Frank's wife of 49 years, sat with her hands folded dry-eyed but hollow. She had known this day would come. Frank's heart had been weak for years, but knowing does not soften the blow. Michael delivered the eulogy. He spoke of his father's work ethic, his quiet manner, his skill with machines. He mentioned the war briefly, the way one mentions weather. Dad served in World War II as a tank mechanic. He didn't talk about it much. He came home, opened a garage, and spent the rest of his life fixing things. Simple, clean, true enough, but incomplete. After the service, as mourners filed out into June sunshine, Michael noticed 3 elderly men standing apart from the crowd. They wore veteran caps. Their posture, even bent with age, carried military bearing. One man sat in a wheelchair pushed by the other 2. All 3 stared at the casket with an intensity that made Michael uncomfortable. He approached them cautiously. "Excuse me. Did you know my father?" The man in the wheelchair looked up. His face, deeply lined and spotted with age, showed eyes that were sharp despite 93 years of use. When he spoke, his voice cracked, but held authority. "Know him, son. We owe him our lives." Michael blinked. "I'm sorry." The man on the left, shorter and rounder, with a thick Brooklyn accent, stepped forward. "Eddie Casper. I was your dad's loader. Sherman Tank, Charlie Company, 3rd Tank Battalion." He gestured to the tall Texan beside him. "Ray Holloway, driver, and this—" He indicated the man in the wheelchair. "Captain Theodore Brennan. He was our battalion armament officer." Michael shook their hands, confused. "I didn't know Dad kept in touch with anyone from the war." "He didn't," Ray said quietly. "We tried. Every year we sent letters, Christmas cards, invitations to reunions. He never came, never wrote back." The Texan's voice thickened. "But we never forgot him." "I don't understand," Michael said. "Dad was just a mechanic. He fixed tanks. That's all he ever told me." Eddie and Ray exchanged glances. Brennan leaned forward in his wheelchair. "Your father did more than fix tanks, son. He saved us. Saved hundreds of us. Maybe thousands." The old captain's hands trembled on the armrests. "And I nearly had him court-martialed for it." Michael felt the ground shift beneath him. "What?" "Listen," Eddie said. "We came a long way to be here. Brooklyn, Texas, Florida. We're old men. This might be our last chance to tell someone the truth about Frank Dalton. You deserve to know who your father really was." They moved to a quiet corner of the cemetery under an oak tree, away from the dispersing crowd. Sarah joined them, sensing something important. She had lived with Frank's silence for nearly 50 years. Perhaps today she would finally understand what he had carried. Michael remembered something. "Wait. When we were cleaning out Dad's office yesterday, I found something strange. A piece of metal in his desk drawer. About 6 inches long aluminum tubing, One end was burned black. There were old tape marks on it. No label, no explanation, just this random piece of metal he kept for decades. Eddie's breath caught. Ray removed his hat. Brennan closed his eyes. That, Brennan said slowly, is why we're alive. That is the reason your father never talked about the war. Because what he did was impossible. And he knew if he told anyone, they would think he was lying. Michael pulled the metal piece from his jacket pocket. He had brought it without knowing why. Something about it had felt important. He held it out. Eddie took it with both hands reverently, as one might hold a religious artifact. His fingers traced the weld marks, the burn damage, the faint remnants of ancient duct tape. August 13th, 1944. Eddie whispered. Hottest day I ever lived through. The day Frank climbed onto the hull of a moving tank under enemy fire and fixed this with duct tape and his own shirt. That's impossible, Michael said. That's what we thought too, Ray replied, until we saw him do it. Sarah spoke for the first time, her voice small. Frank had nightmares for years. He would wake up saying, keep moving, keep moving. I asked him once what the dreams were about. He said he couldn't remember, but I think he remembered everything. Brennan wheeled himself closer to Michael. Your father never sought recognition, never asked for medals, never wanted anyone to know. But before we die, someone needs to hear this story. Someone needs to know that the greatest innovation of the tank war in Europe came from a mechanic with no engineering degree, no formal training, and no permission. I don't understand, Michael said again. You will, Eddie promised, but first you need to understand where your father came from. Not just Ohio, but what made him the man who would do what he did. Ray settled onto a nearby bench. Let me take you back. 1941. Before Pearl Harbor. Before any of us knew what war really meant. The three veterans began to speak, their voices overlapping, correcting each other, filling in gaps. And slowly, like a photograph developing in solution, an image emerged. Not of the quiet mechanic Michael had known, but of someone else entirely. Someone who had changed the war. Someone history forgot. Toledo, Ohio, 1941. Frank Dalton was 21 years old and already tired. He worked in his late father's garage, a small operation on the industrial edge of town. His father had died 2 years earlier in a factory accident, crushed between steel plates. Frank inherited the garage, the debts, and a reputation for being able to fix anything mechanical. Crop dusters, delivery trucks, the occasional tractor. Frank understood engines the way some men understand music. Not through books, but through touch sound intuition. He could hear a misfire in a cylinder from across the garage, could feel a bearing going bad through the vibration in his hands. But he was alone. His mother had died when he was 12. Tuberculosis. No siblings. Few friends. Frank lived in the language of machines because human language had always been harder for him. He was a perfectionist. If a repair was not exactly right, he would tear it apart and start over. This made him excellent at his work, but difficult to know. People found him cold, distant, too precise. He simply could not accept good enough when perfect was possible. The radio on his workbench crackled constantly. By late 1941, the news from Europe was growing darker. Germany swallowing countries. Britain standing alone. America watching, helping from a distance, but not yet committed. Frank listened while he worked. He did not think much about politics or grand strategy. But he understood pressure, stress, systems pushed beyond their design limits. Europe was a machine failing under load. December 7th changed everything. Frank heard about Pearl Harbor on the radio while replacing a fuel pump in a Studebaker delivery truck. The announcer's voice shook. Japanese aircraft. Surprise attack. Battleships burning. Thousands dead. He set down his wrench and stared at the grease-stained wall of the garage. For a long moment, the only sound was the drip of oil into a pan beneath the Studebaker. Then he walked to the recruiting office. The Army took him quickly. Young, strong, mechanically skilled. They promised him aircraft maintenance. With his crop duster experience, it seemed natural. Frank imagined himself working on bomber engines, keeping B-17s flying. The Army had different plans. They put him in a tank. "You scored high on mechanical aptitude," the recruiter said. "Tanks need mechanics, too. Plus you're small. 5'7". You'll fit in the tight spaces." Frank said nothing. He never argued with systems. He adapted to them. By June 1943, he found himself in North Africa, training with the 3rd Tank Battalion. His assigned position gunner and assistant mechanic on Sherman No. 31. The M4 Sherman, America's steel workhorse. 30 tons of armor powered by a Continental radial engine originally designed for aircraft. Frank studied the Sherman like a medical student studies anatomy. He memorized the manual, drew diagrams, calculated heat dissipation rates, and he discovered a problem. The Sherman's cooling system was adequate for short engagements, but in sustained combat, especially in hot climates or dense terrain, the engine temperature would climb dangerously. Once it passed 200 degrees, Fahrenheit seals began to fail. Lubricants broke down. Eventually, the engine would seize. A dead engine in combat meant a dead crew. Frank mentioned this to his sergeant. The man shrugged. "Engines get hot. That's how they work. Don't overthink it, Dalton." But Frank could not stop thinking about it. Then came Sicily, July 1943. Frank's cousin Tommy was also in the Tank Corps. Different company, different crew. Private Thomas Dalton, 19 years old, fresh-faced and terrified, but hiding it well. He drove Sherman No. 47. The two cousins saw each other rarely. Different operational schedules. But when they did meet, they talked about home, about Ohio, about getting back alive. Tommy wrote letters to his mother every week, simple letters. "The food is terrible. The heat is worse. But I'm doing fine. Don't worry about me." On July 18, Tommy's Sherman engaged a German position near a dried riverbed. The fight lasted 40 minutes. Somewhere in that chaos, a round damaged the radiator. Not catastrophically, not enough to stop the tank immediately, but enough to start a slow bleed of coolant. Tommy's commander ordered them to withdraw to regroup, but the engine was already running hot. 210 degrees, 220, 230. The warning lights came on. Tommy reported it. His commander told him to keep moving until they reached friendly lines. Just another mile. They could make it. At 240 degrees, the engine caught fire. The crew tried to evacuate, but extreme heat expands metal. The hull had warped just enough that the escape hatch jammed. Not badly, just enough. Enough to trap 5 men inside a burning steel coffin. By the time another crew pried the hatch open, 4 men were already dead. The 5th died that night in a field hospital. Tommy was one of the 4. Frank received the news 3 days later. Along with it came Tommy's last letter written 2 days before the engagement. Standard cheerful lies for his mother. "I'm doing fine. Don't worry about me." Frank sat with that letter for a long time. Then he went to find the survivors who had helped open the jammed hatch. He asked them what happened. They told him about the overheated engine, the warped metal, the stuck hatch. Tommy did not die from enemy fire. He died because a cooling system failed and metal expanded 3 millimeters too far. After that, Frank changed. He started carrying a notebook. Every time his Sherman ran, he logged temperatures, conditions, duration. He measured everything. His crew thought he was obsessive. Maybe he was. But the data was clear. Under sustained operation, the Sherman's single cooling loop could not handle the thermal load. The system was designed for ideal conditions: clean radiators, good airflow, short engagements. But combat was never ideal. Radiators got clogged with dust. Airflow was blocked by terrain and smoke. Engagement stretched from minutes to hours. The Sherman was slowly cooking its own crews. Frank knew he could not redesign the engine. That would require factory modifications, months of engineering approval from people who would never approve. But he could add capacity, a secondary cooling loop, auxiliary circulation to increase heat dissipation without touching the primary system. It was not elegant, but it might work. By mid-1944, stationed in England preparing for the Normandy invasion, Frank began collecting materials: aluminum tubing from damaged aircraft, a water pump from a wrecked Jeep, rubber hosing from electrical conduits, a jerry can for a reservoir. He worked at night in the motor pool, alone, designing, testing, failing. The first attempt exploded. Water pressure blew a coupling and sprayed coolant everywhere. His loader, Eddie Casper, had been sleeping nearby. The noise woke him. He found Frank soaked and surrounded by scattered parts. Eddie laughed until he cried. "Dalton, what the hell are you doing?" "Giving the tank a bath." Frank said nothing. He just cleaned up the water and started again. Word spread. The quiet mechanic with the crazy cooling system. The guy who thought he was smarter than the engineers at General Motors. They called him Icebox Frank, the plumber. Crazy Dalton. His own crew was skeptical. Ray Holloway, his driver, pulled him aside. "Frank, you're making us look like idiots. Everyone's calling us the crazy crew. I don't want to die because some homemade contraption blows up in my face." Eddie was gentler but equally doubtful. "Look, I know you mean well, but those guys at GM spent years designing this tank. You really think you can improve it with spare parts and duct tape?" Even Lieutenant Mercer, their commander, expressed concern. He called Frank to his tent one evening. Mercer was 31, a former math teacher from Pittsburgh. He was patient but firm. "Dalton, I respect initiative, but this isn't your garage back home. If that system fails and hurts someone I'm responsible, I'll have to write a letter to some mother explaining how her son died because we let a mechanic play inventor." Frank understood. He heard the fear beneath the words, the weight of command, the terrible mathematics of keeping young men alive. "I'll be careful, sir," Frank said. "That's not enough," Mercer replied. "Careful doesn't cut it in combat." But Frank did not stop. He refined the design, reinforced the connections, added pressure relief valves, tested it again and again. By early August, the system actually worked. Sherman No. 31 ran 15 degrees cooler than any other tank in the company. Frank had the data, pages of it, temperature logs that proved the system's effectiveness. Nobody cared about data. They cared about regulations. And Frank's modification violated every rule in the book. Then Captain Theodore Brennan arrived for inspection. Captain Theodore Brennan was 42 years old and had spent 15 years at Ford Motor Company before the war. He believed in systems, procedures, the proper order of things. When he saw Sherman number 31 with its strange aluminum tentacles wrapped around the engine compartment, his face went the color of old chalk. "Sergeant Dalton, explain this." Frank stood at attention. "Auxiliary cooling system, sir. Reduces engine temperature by 10 to 15 degrees under sustained operation." Brennan walked slowly around the tank. He touched the tubing, examined the jerry can reservoir, studied the improvised pump mount. His expression grew darker with each observation. "Do you have authorization for this modification?" "No, sir." "Did you submit an engineering proposal through proper channels?" "No, sir." "Did anyone with actual engineering credentials review this design?" "No, sir." Brennan stopped directly in front of Frank. His voice dropped to something cold and precise. "Then let me explain what you have done, Sergeant. You have violated Technical Order 01-20 EG-2. You have modified defensive equipment without authorization. You have used non-standard parts of unknown provenance. You have created a potential fire hazard on a vehicle carrying explosive ammunition. And you have done all this based on nothing but your own judgment." He paused. Let the words settle. "If this system fails in combat and someone dies, you will be court-martialed for destruction of government property and negligent homicide. If you're lucky, you'll spend the next 20 years in Leavenworth. If you're not lucky, you'll hang." Frank said nothing. There was nothing to say. Everything Brennan stated was technically correct. You have until tomorrow morning to remove this equipment. All of it. If I see one piece of aluminum tubing on this vehicle after Reveille, I will personally write the charges. Understood. Understood, sir. Brennan walked away without looking back. Frank stood motionless until the captain disappeared around a motor pool building. Then he began working, but not to remove the system. He removed it during inspections, hidden the components in carefully prepared locations, then reinstalled everything after Brennan left the area. His crew became accomplices. Eddie helped hide the tubing. Ray kept watch for officers. Even Lieutenant Mercer looked the other way, though he never explicitly approved. It was a dangerous game. Discovery meant prison. But Frank kept thinking about Tommy, about the letter that arrived 3 days too late, about metal expanding 3 millimeters in extreme heat. He would rather face a court-martial than write a letter to Eddie's mother. On August 12th, the orders came down. Charlie Company gathered in a drafty barn near the staging area. 9 Sherman crews. 45 men. A colonel stood before a map pinned to wooden planks. "Gentlemen, this is La Belline Ridge, currently held by German forces. If they reinforce this position, our entire supply corridor gets cut. We need that ridge secured by 1800 hours tomorrow." He traced a line on the map with his finger. 35 miles. Open terrain. Minimal cover. Weather forecast shows temperatures exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. You will have no air support, no reinforcements, no resupply for at least 20 hours. Silence. Every man understood what this meant. The colonel continued. "Intelligence reports enemy anti-tank positions along the approach. Expect resistance. Push through it." Questions? No questions. What questions could there be? The mission was straightforward. Brutal, but straightforward. Drive fast. Drive hard. Take the ridge. Try not to die. After the briefing, Frank walked to Sherman 31. He checked the cooling system 3 times, inspected every connection, tested the pump, topped off the reservoir. His hands were steady, but his mind was not. 18 hours, 100-degree heat, sustained combat speed. Without his system, the Sherman would not last half that time. With it, maybe, just maybe. Eddie found him there past midnight. Can't sleep either. Frank shook his head, checking the system. For the 10th time, Eddie sat on the tank's hull, dangling his legs. You worried it won't work. I'm worried it will fail and kill you. Kill Ray. Kill Lieutenant Mercer. Frank's voice was quiet. I built this thing. If something goes wrong, your deaths are on me. Eddie was silent for a long moment. Then he said something Frank did not expect. And if you didn't build it, we'd probably die anyway. Just slower. From an overheated engine in German territory with no way to run. Frank looked up. I've watched you test this thing for weeks, Eddie continued. I've seen the temperature logs. It works, Frank. Maybe not perfectly, but it works better than what we had before. He shrugged. So the way I see it, we've got a choice. Die with the Army's approved equipment, or maybe live with your unapproved contraption. That's not much of a choice. War doesn't give us much, but I'd rather take a chance on something than accept certain failure. Eddie slid down from the hull. Try to sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long. He walked away. Frank stayed with the tank until dawn. 4:30 in the morning, August 13th, 1944. 9 Shermans rolled out of the staging area in a staggered column. Dust rose behind them like ghosts. The air was already warm. By noon, it would be murderous. Inside Sherman 31, Frank sat in the gunner's position. His right hand rested near the toggle switch that controlled the auxiliary cooling system. He flipped it on. A low hum joined the growl of the engine. Water began circulating through the aluminum vanes. Temperature gauge 85 degrees. Stable. Systems running, Frank reported. Lieutenant Mercer nodded from the commander's position. Let's hope it holds. For the first hour, everything went smoothly. The column moved at 15 to 20 miles per hour across hedgerow country. Visibility was poor. Dust and early morning haze obscured the horizon, but no enemy contact. Just the rumble of engines and the clatter of treads on hard-packed earth. 90 minutes in the first radio call came. 27 to command. Engine temperature climbing. 210 degrees. Repeat 210 and rising. Frank checked his own gauge. 98 degrees. Perfectly safe. More calls followed. 29 here. Coolant boiling over. Have to reduce speed. 24 reporting. Temperature at 215. Losing power. Lieutenant Mercer's jaw tightened. He keyed the radio. Charlie actual to battalion. Multiple vehicles reporting thermal stress. Requesting maintenance halt. The response was immediate and cold. Negative on halt. Mission priority Alpha. Objective must be reached by 1800 hours. Continue advance. Leave disabled vehicles. Repeat, continue advance. No stopping, no repairs. Just push forward and pray. Frank watched the column begin to disintegrate. Sherman 28 pulled off the road, steam erupting from its engine deck. Crew members jumped out frantically, waving others past. 24 slowed to a crawl, limping along at half power. 33 simply stopped its engine, making sounds no engine should make. 36 lasted another 10 minutes before its radiator burst in a cloud of scalding steam. By the 2-hour mark, only 3 Shermans maintained full operational status. 31, 26, 30. By hour 3, it was 2. By hour 4, just 1. Sherman 31, Frank's tank. With its ridiculous aluminum tubing and jerrycan reservoir and hand-welded brackets. The tank everyone had laughed at. The only one still running at full capacity. The ambush came at 11:15. They had reached a tree line near a ruined farmhouse when the first shell screamed across the morning sky. The first shell struck Sherman 30 dead center. The turret lifted off its ring like a cork from a bottle, spinning twice before crashing into the dirt 20 yards away. Fire erupted from the hull. No one got out. Frank watched through his periscope as men he had eaten breakfast with burned alive. "Poc 40, Mercer shouted. 2 positions, maybe 3, in the trees at 11 o'clock. Sherman 26 tried to maneuver. Its commander was good, experienced. He angled for cover behind a stone wall while his gunner searched for targets. But the engine was already struggling. 218 degrees and climbing. The tank moved like a wounded animal, sluggish and desperate. The second German shell caught it in the side. Armor pierced, ammunition cooking off. Secondary explosions ripped the hull apart from inside. In 30 seconds, Charlie Company lost 2 tanks and 10 men. The remaining Shermans scattered. Some found cover. Others simply stopped their engines, finally surrendering to heat and stress. German machine guns opened up, raking the exposed vehicles with fire. Infantry began moving through the trees. Lieutenant Mercer's voice crackled through the radio. "All units status report." The responses came slowly, broken, desperate. 27 here. Engine dead. Crew evacuating. 24. Immobilized. Taking fire. 29. Cannot move. Repeat, cannot move. Mercer looked at Frank. "What about us?" Frank checked the gauge. 106 degrees. The cooling system hummed steadily, circulating water through the auxiliary loop. Heat dissipating into the aluminum tubing. The engine running smooth and strong. "Fully operational, sir." Mercer closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they held something between fear and resolve. "Dalton, you're the only functional tank in this company. Those anti-tank guns are going to pick off our disabled crews one by one unless someone suppresses them." He paused. "I need you to flank left and engage." Eddie's voice came from the loader's position. "Sir, that's suicide. 1 tank against fortified positions." "I know what it is, Casper." Ray Holloway gripped the driver controls. His knuckles were white. "Lieutenant, if we go out there alone." "We die alone instead of together," Mercer finished. "I know, but those men in the disabled tanks are sitting ducks. If we don't draw fire, they're all dead anyway." Silence inside the hull. The sound of distant gunfire, screaming metal, burning fuel. Frank thought about Tommy, about a jammed hatch and expanding metal, about a letter that arrived too late. He keyed the intercom. "Sir, request permission to engage." Mercer stared at him. "You understand what you're volunteering for. Tommy died because his tank stopped moving. We're still moving. That's the only advantage we have." Frank's hand found the cannon controls. "Better to die fighting than cooking in a dead engine." Mercer nodded slowly. "Driver flank left. Gunner weapons free." Ray pushed the throttles forward. Sherman 31 lurched into motion, breaking from the scattered remnants of the column and angling toward the German positions. Immediately, fire concentrated on them. Machine gun rounds sparked off the hull. A Pac 40 shell screamed past, missing the turret by inches. Another buried itself in the dirt to their right, showering the tank with debris. Frank ignored it. He found the first muzzle flash in his scope. Calculated distance. Lead. Elevation. Fired. The 75mm cannon roared. The shell struck a tree line position, detonating in a spray of wood and earth. A German gun went silent. Reload. Eddie slammed another round into the breech. Frank adjusted aim. Fired again. A second position erupted. Sherman 31 kept moving. Ray drove like a man possessed, weaving between shell craters using every fold in the terrain. The tank was never still, never an easy target. And through it all, the engine ran cool. 108 degrees, 110, stable. Then came the sound Frank had dreaded. Ping. A different kind of impact. Not the heavy clang of machine gun fire. Something sharper, more precise. He looked through the periscope and saw it. A bullet had pierced one of the aluminum cooling tubes. Water sprayed out in a fine mist, evaporating almost instantly in the engine heat. "Frank," Eddie shouted. The system. The temperature gauge began climbing. 108, 112, 118. Frank made a decision in less than a second. He handed his firing controls to Eddie. The loader had never trained as a gunner, but this was war. You learned or you died. Eddie grabbed the controls and kept firing while Frank climbed out, popped the turret hatch, and climbed out onto the hull of a moving tank under enemy fire. Machine gun rounds snapped past his head. The tank lurched over rough ground, nearly throwing him off. Smoke and dust filled his lungs. But he crawled toward the engine deck, toward the ruptured tube that was bleeding his creation dry. The water was hot. It burned his hands as he worked. He had no proper tools, no replacement parts, just a roll of duct tape in his pocket and the shirt on his back. He wrapped the tape around the puncture. It held for 2 seconds, then peeled away under pressure. He tried again. Same result. The temperature hit 122 degrees. Frank tore off his shirt, ripped it into strips, wrapped them around the tube, then covered everything with tape and secured it with wire from his pocket. The repair was ugly, desperate, held together by nothing but friction and hope. Water still seeped through, but slower now. The circulation continued diminished but functional. He slid back through the hatch, hands blistered, chest bare, lungs burning. "Status," Mercer demanded. Frank checked the gauge. 125 degrees, still climbing, but slower, much slower. "System damaged but operational. We can still move." Eddie stared at him. "You just climbed onto a moving tank in the middle of a firefight to fix a water leak with your shirt. It worked. You're insane." "Probably." Sherman 31 continued its assault. Frank took back the cannon controls, found the remaining German positions, destroyed them one by one. By noon, the anti-tank guns were silenced, the left flank was clear, and Frank's ridiculous contraption patched with duct tape and cotton fabric had held together through everything. The marathon continued, 18 hours, no stops, no shutdowns. Sherman 31 pushed forward while other tanks limped behind or were abandoned entirely. By 6 o'clock that evening, when Charlie Company finally reached La Belline Ridge, only one tank arrived on schedule. One tank, crewed by 4 exhausted men, held together by ingenuity, desperation, and a cooling system that everyone had called stupid. Frank climbed out onto the ridge and looked back at the trail of smoke and destruction behind them. Somewhere in that chaos, men had died because their engines failed, because metal expanded in heat, because systems designed for ideal conditions met the brutal reality of war. But not his crew. Not today. Lieutenant Mercer stood beside him, equally exhausted, equally stunned. "Dalton," he said quietly, "I believe I owe you an apology." Frank shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, sir. I owe you my life. We all do." Mercer looked at the battered tank, its aluminum tubing blackened, its improvised repairs visible for all to see. "That thing saved us." 10 minutes later, The remaining Shermans began arriving, limping, smoking, barely functional. Their crews stared at Sherman 31 with something between disbelief and reverence. No one was laughing anymore. Captain Theodore Brennan arrived at Labeline Ridge the following morning. He came by jeep from battalion headquarters, summoned by reports that defied everything he understood about tank mechanics. One Sherman operational for 18 consecutive hours. One tank reaching the objective on schedule while 8 others failed. One crew surviving what should have been a death march through enemy territory and 100-degree heat. Brennan walked around Sherman 31 slowly. The tank looked like it had crawled through hell and dragged itself back. Bullet scars covered the hull. The aluminum tubing was blackened and warped. Strips of fabric, clearly torn from a shirt, wrapped around a section of pipe held together by melted duct tape and twisted wire. It was the ugliest piece of machinery he had ever seen. It had also saved 9 lives and completed an impossible mission. Frank stood at attention nearby, waiting. His hands were bandaged where the hot water had burned him. His chest was bare beneath his jacket since his shirt now served as emergency plumbing supplies. He looked exhausted, hollow, but his eyes remained steady. Brennan stopped in front of him. "Sergeant Dalton." "Sir." Brennan was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the cold authority from their previous encounter. Instead, there was something unfamiliar in it. Something that might have been humility. "I came here intending to have this equipment removed, and you placed under arrest for violating my direct orders." Frank said nothing. There was nothing to say. "But I cannot do that." Brennan looked back at the tank. "Because you were right, and I was wrong. The regulations I cited were designed for ideal conditions. Peacetime conditions. They do not account for what happens when men must drive 35 miles through enemy fire in temperatures that would melt factory specifications." He turned back to Frank. "You saw a problem that the engineers at General Motors missed. You built a solution with scrap metal and determination. And when that solution was damaged in combat, you climbed onto a moving tank under fire to repair it with your bare hands and your own clothing." Brennan shook his head slowly. "I have been in the Army for 15 years. I have never seen anything like that. I was just trying to keep my crew alive, sir." "That is exactly what you did, and I suspect you kept more than just your crew alive." Brennan pulled a folded document from his pocket. "Battalion received interrogation reports this morning. German prisoners from the units we engaged yesterday. They believed they were attacked by multiple tanks. Some estimated 4. Others said 6 or 8. A few mentioned American artillery support." Frank blinked. "There was no artillery, sir. Just us." "I know. But you moved so continuously, repositioned so often, that the Germans could not track you accurately. They assumed multiple vehicles because they could not believe one tank was doing all that damage." Brennan almost smiled. "You did not just survive, Sergeant. You created tactical confusion that multiplied your apparent force several times over." He folded the document and put it away. "I want to learn how your system works, and I want it installed on every Sherman in this battalion." For a moment, Frank did not understand. "Sir, you heard me. I was wrong about the regulations. I was wrong about your qualifications. And I was wrong to threaten you with court-martial for trying to save lives." Brennan extended his hand. "I am asking you to teach us what you know." Frank stared at the hand. Then slowly, he took it. The production began immediately. Staff Sergeant Vincent Corso, the battalion's senior mechanic, worked with Frank to document the system. They created diagrams, specified materials, developed installation procedures that could be replicated across multiple vehicles. Within a week, 18 Shermans in Charlie Company had auxiliary cooling systems. Each one looked slightly different depending on available materials and the skills of the mechanics who built it, but they all followed the same principle: secondary circulation, external heat dissipation, increased thermal capacity without modifying the primary engine. The results were immediate and dramatic. On August 25th, Charlie Company advanced 28 miles through territory even hotter than the La Baleine approach. The 18 tanks with modified cooling systems completed the mission without a single heat-related failure. The 4 tanks awaiting modification had 3 breakdowns. The mathematics were undeniable. Word spread through unofficial channels. Mechanics from other units came to observe. Some brought notebooks. Others brought scrap aluminum and asked for guidance. Frank showed them everything, held nothing back. He did not want credit. He wanted other crews to survive. By early September, an estimated 40 to 50 Shermans across the European theater had some version of the system. None were officially authorized. None appeared in any technical manual. The Army bureaucracy moved too slowly to acknowledge innovations from the field. But the tanks kept running, and the crews kept living. German intelligence noticed the change. Interrogation records from September 1944 show repeated references to improved American tank reliability. German commanders reported that their standard tactic of prolonging engagements to induce mechanical failures was becoming less effective. Some suspected the Americans had received new equipment. Others theorized secret modifications at the factory level. None guessed that the improvement came from a mechanic with no engineering degree working with duct tape and aircraft wreckage. One captured German lieutenant, a man named Hans Richter, who had commanded a tank destroyer unit, provided a detailed account of the August 13th engagement. "We expected the American tanks to fail from overheating. Our intelligence indicated this was a consistent weakness of the Sherman. We planned to use sustained harassment to force breakdowns, then destroy the disabled vehicles. But one tank would not stop. It continued moving for hours, through our fire, through temperatures that should have killed any engine. We called it the ghost tank because it seemed impossible. It should have died, but it did not." The German High Command issued revised tactical guidelines later that month. Units were instructed to avoid prolonged engagements with American armor when possible. The assumption that Shermans would self-destruct in extended combat could no longer be relied upon. Frank never saw these intelligence reports. He did not know that his modification had changed German tactical doctrine. He simply continued working, maintaining Sherman 31, helping other crews install similar systems, doing the job. But there was no official recognition. No medal, no commendation, no formal acknowledgement of any kind. The Army could not publicly reward a soldier for violating technical orders regardless of the outcome. Doing so would undermine the entire system of regulations and authority. Frank understood this. He did not expect gratitude from institutions. Institutions operated on different principles than individuals. Lieutenant Mercer wrote a report recommending that Frank's methodology be studied for potential implementation across all armored units. The report traveled up the chain of command. It was red-filed and forgotten. Captain Brennan personally advocated for formal recognition. His requests were politely declined. Regulations had been violated. Precedent could not be set. But something else happened. Something quieter, but perhaps more significant. The mechanics who learned from Frank taught others. The techniques spread through the tank core like water through sand, invisible from above, but transforming everything below. By the time the war ended, cooling system modifications were so common that many crews assumed they were standard equipment. Nobody remembered where the innovation came from. Nobody except the men who had been there. Eddie Casper returned to Brooklyn after the war. He opened a bakery with his brother. Every August 13th, he closed early and sat alone in the back room, remembering the day he should have died. Ray Holloway went back to Texas, cattle ranching, wide open spaces where he never felt trapped again. He named his first son Frank, though he never explained why to anyone outside the family. Lieutenant Mercer became a high school principal in Pittsburgh. He kept a photograph of Sherman 31 on his desk until he retired. When students asked about it, he said only that it was an old friend. Captain Brennan stayed in the Army, rose to colonel before retiring in 1963. He spent his later years writing letters to military engineering journals, arguing for more flexibility in field modifications. Nobody listened, but he kept writing, and Frank Dalton went home to Ohio. He returned to Toledo in the summer of 1945. Married Sarah, his high school sweetheart, who had waited 4 years for letters that rarely came. Opened a small garage on the same street where his father's shop had once stood. Fixed trucks, tractors, the occasional airplane engine for local crop dusters. He never spoke about the war. Sarah learned not to ask. When nightmares came, when Frank woke sweating and muttering about keeping moving, she held him until he calmed. She did not press for explanations. Some wounds do not heal through talking. They heal through silence and time, and the steady rhythm of ordinary days. Michael was born in 1947, Anna in 1949. They grew up in a house where the war was a closed door. Their father had served. That was all they knew. That was all they were meant to know. Michael sometimes wondered about the metal fragment in his father's desk drawer. Once as a teenager, he asked about it. "Souvenir," Frank said. Nothing more. The fragment stayed in that drawer for 50 years, through moves and renovations and the slow accumulation of a life. Frank never displayed it, never explained it, but he never threw it away either. In 1952, a young engineer named Richard Holbrook contacted Frank through the Veterans Administration. Holbrook worked for the Army Ordnance Department reviewing field modifications from the war to identify innovations worth incorporating into new designs. He had found references to an auxiliary cooling system in old maintenance logs from the 3rd Tank Battalion. The system had no official designation, no engineering documentation, just scattered notes about a sergeant named Dalton who had improved Sherman thermal performance by 15 degrees. Holbrook traveled to Toledo, sat in Frank's garage, asked questions. Frank drew the system from memory, explained the principles, described the materials, answered every technical question with the patience of a man who had spent his life understanding machines. Holbrook was astonished. "You're not an engineer," he said, "but you solved a problem that our best designers missed. You thought like an engineer without any of the training." Frank shrugged. "I thought like a man who didn't want to die." Holbrook took the drawings back to Washington. The principles Frank had pioneered found their way into new tank designs: the M46, the M47, the M48 Patton. Each generation incorporated improved cooling systems with multiple circulation loops and external heat dissipation. Frank's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. The innovations were listed as standard design practices evolved through normal engineering processes. No credit, no acknowledgement. Frank did not know, did not ask, did not care. He continued fixing engines in Toledo, watching his children grow, living the quiet life he had earned through survival. The reunion invitation arrived in 1983. 3rd Tank Battalion, 40th Anniversary Gathering, Chicago. Sarah found it in the mail. She brought it to Frank, who was elbow deep in a Chevrolet transmission. "You should go," she said. Frank wiped his hands, looked at the invitation, set it aside. "I don't think so." "Frank," Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, "you've never talked about what happened. Not to me, not to the children. Maybe it's time. Some things don't need talking about. Maybe not for you, but those men remember. They've been sending letters for 40 years, Christmas cards, reunion notices. You never respond." She touched his arm. "They want to see you, Frank. Whatever happened over there, they want to see you again." Frank was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, I'll go." Chicago, October 1983. The reunion took place in a hotel ballroom decorated with unit flags and wartime photographs. Old men in veteran caps milled about, recognizing faces aged beyond recognition, embracing strangers who had once been brothers. Frank stood near the entrance, uncomfortable in a crowd after decades of solitary work. He did not know how to be here, did not know what to say. Then Eddie Casper found him. Eddie was 71 now, rounder, grayer, but his eyes were the same. That Brooklyn spark, that loader's quick humor. "Frank Dalton, you actually came." "Sarah made me." Eddie laughed. The years fell away. Suddenly, they were young again, terrified and alive in a steel box rolling toward German guns. "Ray's here too, and you won't believe this." Eddie lowered his voice. "Brennan, the captain who tried to court-martial you. He's 93 years old in a wheelchair, and he flew from Florida to be here. Brennan, he's been trying to find you for years. We all have, but you never answered." Before Frank could respond, Ray Holloway appeared. Tall and weathered, still carrying himself like a man who spent his life on horseback. He grabbed Frank's hand in both of his and did not let go. 40 years, Ray said. 40 years I've wanted to thank you properly." "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. We all do." They found Brennan in a quiet corner, his wheelchair positioned to face the room. At 93, he was frail and spotted with age, but his eyes remained sharp, military bearing intact despite the body's surrender. When he saw Frank, something in his face changed, softened. "Sergeant Dalton, at last." Frank approached slowly. "Captain." "Not captain anymore. Haven't been for 30 years. Just Theodore now." The old man reached up with a trembling hand. Frank took it. "I have waited decades to say this to your face. I was wrong. About everything. About the regulations. About your qualifications. About what was possible." "You were doing your job, sir." "I was being a fool, and you saved my men despite my foolishness." Brennan's grip tightened. "After the war, I spent 20 years in the Ordnance Department. I pushed your ideas into every new design I could influence. Your name never appeared on any document. That was wrong too. But I wanted you to know. The tanks we built after the war, the cooling systems, the thermal management, it all came from you." Frank stared at him. "I didn't know." "How could you? You never came to reunions, never answered letters. You just disappeared back into Ohio and left us wondering if you even remembered." "I remembered everything." Frank's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's why I couldn't come back, because remembering hurt too much." The four men sat together until midnight. Eddie, Ray, Brennan, Frank. They talked about that August day, about the heat, the fear, the impossible survival. They talked about the men who did not come home, about letters written and letters received. And finally, after 40 years of silence, Frank told them about Tommy, about the cousin who died in a jammed hatch, about the letter that arrived too late, about the promise he made to himself that he would never let another crew burn because of an engine failure. When he finished, no one spoke. Eddie reached out and gripped Frank's shoulder. "You saved us because you couldn't save him." Frank nodded, eyes wet, voice gone. "Then Tommy saved us too," Eddie said quietly, "through you." The reunion ended. The old men scattered back to their lives, but something had finally closed, a circle completed, a silence broken. Frank returned to Toledo, returned to his garage, returned to Sarah and the quiet life he had built. He died 12 years later. Heart attack, quick and clean, the way he would have wanted. And in his desk drawer where it had rested for 50 years lay a piece of aluminum tubing, burned at one end, marked with old welds and ancient tape residue, a fragment of the impossible. His son Michael found it 3 days after the funeral, held it without understanding. Then 3 old men arrived to explain. And finally, someone knew the truth about Frank Dalton. Not a hero, not a genius, just a mechanic who refused to let his crew die, who built something everyone laughed at, who climbed onto a moving tank under fire to save his ridiculous invention with duct tape in his own shirt. War does not care about regulations or credentials. It cares only about who keeps moving when everyone else stops. Frank Dalton kept moving, and 50 years later, that was all that mattered. Michael stood alone in the garage for a long time after the old men left. He looked at the aluminum fragment in his hands, burned, scarred, held together by nothing but determination. The next morning, he drove to a trophy shop, had a small display case made, glass front, wooden base, a brass plate with simple words, "Francis Dalton, 3rd Tank Battalion, August 13th, 1944, the man who refused to stop." He mounted it on the wall of his father's garage, where customers could see it, where his own children would ask about it someday. And when they asked, he would tell them the story, not of a hero, not of a genius, just of a mechanic who built something everyone laughed at, who climbed onto a moving tank under fire, who saved lives that history forgot to count. Because that is how legacies survive, not in medals or monuments, but in stories passed from one generation to the next. Frank Dalton never asked to be remembered, but now he would be.